So today I've kind of structured my talk into three parts. First, we're going to talk about how we are depolarized ourselves, or excuse me, how we are polarized ourselves, and how we often become even more polarized by talking with people that we agree with. Second, we'll talk about skills that you can use to have dialogues with those that you disagree with. And then finally, at the very end, I'll give you more information about Braver Angels and share the next steps if you're interested. Throughout the morning, we're going to have probably around 4 breakout sessions where you can share your own ideas in groups of 4. And then after those, we'll come together and have some group discussions as well. That'll be great. Okay, so where do we start depolarizing? So the natural inclination is to do what I tried to do and jump right in and try to start depolarizing the interaction between opposite political orientations of colors like reds and blues. But that's a really complicated interaction, and Braver Angels has specific workshops to address such interactions that help to make that go much better. The red-blue workshop is an example of that. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. This morning, we're going to start with perhaps a surprising source of depolarization, and that would be ourselves. So a surprising amount of today's environment of toxic polarization is driven by how we talk with like-minded people about people on the other side. We become agents of polarization when we use any of the what are called the 4 horsemen of polarization. That would be stereotyping, dismissing, ridiculing, and contempt. And these 4 horsemen offer us an artificial unity. People might say only smart people like you and me know what the country needs. It offers an outrage machine. People say, there go those crazy people again. And you feel that sense of tribalism effectively. You're bonding over tearing another side down. And it also offers the illusion that vanquishing the other side is going to lead to some political promised land. So as we retreat into our political silos, people on the other side become not just strangers, but enemies. And how we talk to ourselves about them fuels those fires that threaten our democracy. But what if together we were able to learn the discipline of non-polarizing attitudes? And it's important to remember that when we talk about polarization, we're not referring to sharp disagreements on issues or philosophy. That's actually a healthy thing in our democracy. What we're talking about here is how we regard and talk about large groups of ordinary people on the other political side. So we're not trying to say that political disagreement is inappropriate. In fact, it's very appropriate, and it's the way our democracy works. It's just the tone of how we talk about the other side. So today we're going to begin with a way for each of us to assess how polarized we are in our own mind and heart. We're going to talk about how to change our internal polarizer and how to be critical without stereotyping or dismissing or ridiculing or contempt. So I'm going to walk you guys through a series of 6 questions. And if you've got a pen or pencil nearby and some paper, you might want to make notes, because this is going to be one of the things you discuss in your breakout groups, or you can make notes on your computer if that's not available. For the first 5 questions that we're going to go over, you're going to write down often, sometimes, or never. Those are your 3 choices for answers. And the last question is a little different. We'll see when we get there. So keep in mind that this is not about how you feel about specific issues like immigration or healthcare, or specific political figures, or even specific people in your life, like your brother or sister who is the polar opposite of what you believe politically, or how about you feel about particular fringe groups on the other side. What this is all about is how you think about the large number of your fellow Americans out there who differ from you politically. When answering these questions, some people find it helpful to think about all those people who support politicians like Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, or policies like the single-payer healthcare system, that you might find appalling or bad for the country, or you can also think about groups of people on your own political side who drive you crazy as well. So again, if you could just answer for yourself each of these 6 questions as we go through them. The first is, how often do I find myself thinking about these people on the other political side without much regard for the variation among them?
Often.
Usually we're aware of great variation within our own group. Again, you answer that often, sometimes, or never. Second, how often do I find myself assigning mainly self-serving or negative motives to the other group and mainly positive motives to my group? Often, sometimes, or never. How often do I find myself focusing on the most extreme or outrageous ideas and people on the other side, thereby making it hard to see how a reasonable person could remain in that group? Often, sometimes, or never. How often do I find myself comparing the worst people on the other side with the best people on my side?
That's an interesting one. I bet that's more often than I realize.
Yeah. How often do I feel a rush of pleasure with friends when we ridicule those crazies on the other political side? And then this is the different one. This one you won't answer often, sometimes, or never. This one, which of the following is closest to my overall emotional attitude towards the majority of people who support the other side? First, I hate them. They're enemies out to destroy the country. Second is disdain. They are ignorant and should know better. In the middle is pity. They're well-meaning, but they've been duped. A little bit further down the spectrum is basic respect. They make contributions, even if they're mostly off base. And then you might get all the way to respect and appreciation. They make unique and necessary contributions to our society. Okay, so now let's have a little personal reflection. Got a timer here on the screen. Take a short time to go over your answers and assess your degree of interpolarization. Keep the focus off of yourself and your own attitudes, keep your focus on yourself and your own attitudes, not on how difficult those other people are. And it's really, this should be an exercise in humility. So avoid falling into the temptation of bashing the other side indirectly. For example, it's not a time to think, these people are so awful that I find it hard to rise above my justifiably negative attitudes towards them. You're not really doing the work there. That's just an excuse to criticize the other side some more.
Mike, excuse me, could you keep the questions on the screen? There were so many of them.
Yeah, what I'll do is during the 2 minutes, I'll start adding them into the chat. Or actually, I'll just go back instead of having the counter here, and I'll just put them back on the screen. All right, let's see. There you go. There are your 6 questions. Take about, how about a minute to think about that, and then we'll come back and Bruce will send you to your breakout rooms.
Would be helpful if you could also add them to the chat so we can copy them and save them.
All right, I'll see if I can do that quickly here.
Okay.
There it is. Okay.
Oh, great. Thanks, Todd.
As one who deals with way too many PowerPoints during the week, I'm surprised I'm going to ask this question, but is there any way we can get a copy of these slides?
Yes, I believe so.
Thank you.
I'll get with Bruce and see if we can't send it out
All
later.
right, thank you.
I
All
see
right.
that. Hello?
Yes.
I see that there's a recording being made. Will we be able to get a recording of the meeting?
Yeah, that might be an easier way to do it. But I think I can also share the slides as well. Next topic here is political stereotypes. So remember, stereotypes are how outsiders oversimplify or dismiss or lump together and disparage the other. Based on, so we have these red blue workshops in Braver Angels. And one of the exercises that we do in these workshops is we ask each side to identify the most common stereotypes that they run into about their own side. And these are the most common stereotypes. Reds, conservative folks, think that blues often see them as racist, anti-immigrant, uncaring about those in need, homophobic, anti-woman, anti-science, and Bible thumpers. So these are what conservatives think are unfair stereotypes that liberals have about them. And then on the other side, blues think reds see them as arrogant, elitists favoring big government for its own sake, fiscally irresponsible, unpatriotic, anti-religious, against free speech if it's not politically correct, and hypersensitive snowflakes. Again, those are stereotypes that blues think that reds have unfairly about them. But another aspect of this exercise that we do in our red workshops is each side is required to say, okay, these are the unfair stereotypes, but here's a kernel of truth in there. This is why I think the other side might think that, or maybe even, you know what, there are some people on our side that are exactly this way, and I'm embarrassed about it too. So it's a really interesting exercise. It's the first one that we do in those workshops. So here's some way to counter stereotypes in your own thinking. First, you can tell yourself that the other side is more varied than that stereotype is. You can acknowledge that their political views and motivations are no doubt more complicated than the rhetoric that you've been hearing. You can recognize that the life experiences informing their views are likely different from your own. You can develop relationships with a variety of people who differ from you politically. Relationships tend to undermine those stereotypes. And you can read and listen to thought leaders on the other side who present more complicated arguments than the argument that gets to you distilled through Twitter. And if you want to go all out, you can work to develop an understanding of the history and the current strands of thought on the other side, and that'll give you a really good understanding of where the other side is coming from. Another important thing to consider is how we listen to those that we disagree with. First, you can distinguish between positions and people. You can believe that a viewpoint is completely wrong without believing that everyone who holds that idea is stupid or ill-motivated. You can completely disagree with an idea and separate that from criticizing the person that holds that idea. Second, you can distinguish between policies and core values in addition to the people. Policies are a means to the ends or ways to support or enact values, not the values themselves. So people can differ sharply on policies like the role of government, and nevertheless have similar ultimate goals for the country that you might too share. It's just a different way to the same end, and you might disagree about their logic of the way to get there, but you're both wanting the same thing for the country. It's always often nice to remind yourself of that. And lastly, you can distinguish between inconsistency and hypocrisy. So resist the pull towards assuming that inconsistencies on the other side always reveal hypocrisy. Inconsistencies between stated values and actual behavior can come from just blind spots and the inevitable tensions that happen when you have competing values with one another. So be reluctant to assign the label of hypocrite to a large number of your fellow citizens who disagree with you, even when their positions might seem contradictory to you, probably because you seem contradictory to them. So keep that in mind too.
To be quiet.
Now we're going to talk about how to talk with people on your own side about people on the other side in a non-polarizing way. Mistakes to avoid.
Could you?
The first we already kind of mentioned earlier. It's a
Could
pretty
you go
obvious
back to
one.
that
Avoid using labels. Don't use wingnut or Bible thumper or libtard or snowflake. But here is one that's more difficult to avoid and that we're all likely guilty of, is avoid using the phrase they all, or its equivalent, those Democrats or those Republicans. Those are classic stereotype phrases. I catch myself doing this all the time and saying, well, that side thinks this. That probably indicates that you're taking too far of a step into stereotyping. Also avoid painting all supporters of a politician with the same brush that you use for that politician. So if you go on a rant about any politician, make it clear that you're not putting all the supporters into the same box as that politician. So you might say, you know, I'm only talking about X politician right now, not about everyone who voted for him or her. When you're talking about people on your own side, you can catch yourself so you're not criticizing the entire group. And remember, criticize the idea or the policy, not the motives of everyone who holds it. So an example of this here, we've got a progressive talking to other progressives about climate change. A good statement that that progressive would make would be, climate change denial is the riskiest idea I've seen in my lifetime because we're running out of time to prevent lasting damage to the planet. That is a strong support for a policy. Great to have. You just helped the conversation. You got your point across. A less helpful statement would be, climate change deniers care more about the fossil fuel industry than about the planet. That's stereotyping the other side, and it's creating polarization. Let's be fair. An example of a conservative talking to other conservatives on the same topic. Good statement would be, climate science is uncertain enough that I don't think that we should start overhauling our way of life. That's a positive policy statement. A not so positive statement would be, climate change supporters have a liberal agenda to overregulate the economy and tax us to death. Remember, let's think about what to remember here. When you're having conversations with people that you agree with, remember to occasionally criticize your own side. You might say, we are losing that group because we haven't really listened to them very well. Or you can say, sometimes our leaders talk as if they have the final answer to name whatever complex problem. And you know what? I don't think that they do. I think they need to put some more thought into this. You can also remember to say something positive about the other side. You can say, I read a liberal or conservative commentator who said something really interesting about this. I might not agree with it, but I found it interesting. Or you could say, I think their criticism has some validity, even if I don't agree with that solution. And finally, try this eavesdropper thought experiment. You might ask, you're having this conversation with somebody that you agree with, and then ask yourself, how would a rational and well-intentioned member of the other group feel when listening to you describe their position in your conversation? Would they feel respected, even if they feel strongly disagreed with, or would they feel disrespected? And would they feel understood, at least partly, or would they feel grossly misrepresented? Okay, so let's do another breakout session here. Think about the material that we just covered and reflect on which of the depolarizing strategies you would like to focus on in the future. Again, we're talking more about talking with people in your day-to-day life that you probably agree with politically. Keep the focus on yourself as opposed to how hard it is not to disparage those other difficult people. Let's move on. Okay, so that ends the first part of our conversation about how to talk with people that you agree with. Now we have a whole workshop on this, so I'm gonna just hit the high points here, but let's talk about strategies that you can do to talk with people that you disagree with. So first, the most important thing to remember is to find expectations to abandon. So expectations to abandon. First, abandon your desire that you can persuade others to change core attitudes and beliefs. Second, abandon any expectation that you're going to agree on facts. or on logic that's going to be followed consistently. We see this one all the time. Like, that's in today's society, that's the one that we really struggle with a lot, is you get into a conversation and you realize you're just dealing with a completely different set of facts. Somebody believes A, you believe B, they're impossible to reconcile. That's okay. And you don't have to say, guess what, your fact is wrong and mine is right, because they're going to say exactly the same thing in reverse. What you can do is together say, that's really interesting that you believe that. This is what I believe. Let's figure out how we got here. And that pulls you into your sources, and it's a fascinating conversations just to see how different we are finding sources of information. Lastly, expectations to abandon is don't assume that your conversation partners are going to match your openness. Hopefully they will. Honor them by thinking that they will, but don't necessarily assume it. So some core principles that Braver Angels approach to having difficult political conversations here are respect, curiosity, and openness tend to elicit the same from the other person. If you start listening to the other person, oftentimes they start listening to you as well. Remember that everybody needs to save face. No one should be portrayed as stupid or blind or self-serving or bigoted. And then lastly, most people in a relationship have some common ground values and concerns that you can be unearthed. So if you just talk long enough, you'll see that even that person that you think is completely the opposite of you, what do you know? It turns out you guys actually do have some common ground.
Amen.
So a few cautions about using these skills in real life political discussions. First, timing is key. Start at a calm moment and not after somebody is in mid-rant. Sometimes it's best to let them go and then not engage. But if they do appear to be thoughtful, that might be a good time to have that conversation with the person that you've been wanting to talk to for a long time. Second, know your partner. Best to do this when it's somebody that you might want to hear your point of view. Practice one-on-one first before you have group conversations. And then Bruce and I were just talking about this while you were in your breakout groups. Be extra careful using these skills online. You shouldn't go to Facebook or Twitter to try to use these skills for the first time in the real world, since it's much harder to control the tone, especially because of all the people that chime in. We found that even these Zoom calls are a little more difficult than face-to-face. So hopefully we'll have time at the end to talk about what's coming ahead for Braver Angels, but we're really excited to get back to in-person workshops as opposed to Zoom workshops coming soon. Tone setting. Another useful thing when talking with somebody that you disagree with about politics is to make sure that you set the tone about wanting to have a constructive conversation instead of an insulting debate. You can let the other person know that you want to understand the other perspectives better. For instance, you could say, I'm finding myself curious about the views of people who are different from the people that I tend to hang out with. That automatically signals at the beginning of the conversation that you're not trying to change their mind. You are entering the conversation to understand where they're coming from. You can ask permission to pose questions. You can say, can I ask you something about politics and your views on something? Can I ask what people in your part of the country are saying about what's going on in Washington these days? Those are great ways to appear introspective. Acknowledge your own general political stance. You can say, as you probably know, I'm progressive or conservative or a Democrat or a Trump supporter, and that's the perspective I'm coming from. A lot of times in our meetings, even if we're not talking about politics, we will put a B for blue in front of our name or an R for red, just as a reminder that this is where I'm coming from politically, and that you can seek them out for, well, what's your backstory? What led you to believe the way that you are? And then another trick that you can do is to offer something critical of your own side and credit something positive to the other side to signal that you're willing to listen to both sides here. So as a blue, you might say, I think Democrats have been out of touch with a lot of people in rural communities and Rust Belt towns. The Republican Party has picked up on that. If you were conservative, you might say, I think conservatives sometimes come across like they don't really care about minorities. And liberals have done a better job of connecting with minority groups. So
let me mention one other thing, just my pet thing, which is about tone setting. I think, one thing you would not disagree with is that everyone in this room is a human being. There's a fundamental being aspect of who we are. The other fundamental thing about every person in this room, other than Jeremy, who is about to become one, is an American citizen. And, you know, I think having that fundamental understanding and sort of saying it, you know, we are all Americans, you know, is important to kind of have as a context.
Well said, Bruce. You're exactly right. Just the organization itself, very briefly here, so we can, I'll end my portion here at 11:30 so you can do your wrap up. If this conversation resonated with you, we'd love to have your continued involvement with Braver Angels. Best way for next steps for you is just to Google Braver Angels and it'll go to the national website. It's braverangels.org. And I encourage you to sign up there for the email list. One, National would not forgive me if I didn't say that you have the opportunity to become a member and give them some dollars, but it's only $12 for membership. That's $12 a year, so it's quite a bargain. It does go to support the great work that the national organization does, and you're free, of course, to give more. But even if you're not ready to give cash, just signing up on that mailing list, that's how I keep tabs on how things are going in various parts of the state. And it would be that list that I would provide more information on once we start doing in-person events in Houston. There are other more established chapters throughout the country. I know all of you aren't in Houston. So you'll show up on radars from elsewhere in the country as well. So definitely, if you're interested in this, sign up on that national mailing list, because that's how we can find you again.
Could you put the website in the chat, Mike?
Yeah, I'll put the website in the chat as well as my email address while you guys are checking out. And feel free with that email address to reach out to me with any questions you might have, interest, getting involved. And if you're not in Houston, I can hook you up with folks in your part of the country. And if you are in Houston, I'll definitely be happy to chat with you as we try to get an alliance going in Houston. Other things that you can do with Braver Angels is the national organization has Braver Angels debates on a pretty regular basis. I think they're still doing them about once a week now. And there's always one controversial topic. And you can log on. Usually there's hundreds of people in the room and hear the viewpoint of somebody on each side back and forth. It's very highly moderated. So it's not two people arguing with one another. It's you hear one side and then everybody can ask that person questions, but it's moderated questions. And the questions are not meant to be, here, let me point out to you why you're wrong with this question. I know you can't answer this question because you're completely off base. That question would never get through. It's got to be a question of, that's really interesting on what you thought there. I don't quite understand it. Let me ask this follow-up question so I can understand you more. I've learned so much from debates. We also do them. They can be done at the local level in person or on Zoom as well. So we have smaller debates in Central Texas with 30 people or so, and then everybody gets a chance to give their opinion. Those are great experiences. I will also put into, at the national level, there's many different types of workshops that can also be offered on the local level. I mentioned a red-blue workshop earlier. That's kind of the flagship experience. You take 6 to 8 people on the right, 6 to 8 people on the left, and 2 moderators lead them through a workshop over either a half day or a whole Saturday. And it's just, that's how we got started in Central Texas, with one of those workshops. And it's just transformative to see that we're all pulling in the same direction, even though we don't agree. There's a lot of common ground there, and at least there's a lot of the same love for the country and humanity. So we'll be offering those in person in Houston soon. We can also do those online. So take a look at those. And then finally, I'm going to post the Central Texas website into the chat as well. We're doing about one event a week via Zoom, And those range from the media action group, which I spoke about earlier. We're about to get that fired up again. We also do what we call the Constitution Study Group. And about every 3 weeks, we take one portion of the Constitution, either one of the amendments or a couple of the amendments, or an article in the main body of it. And one person volunteers to do 15 minutes background discussion, what's interesting in there. And then we talk about it in breakout rooms for a group. It lasts an hour. It's usually done on the weeknights. The next one we have coming up, which I think is already on the calendar, is the 2 prohibition amendments, which I knew nothing about, but I'm going to be giving the talk on it. So I'm about to learn a lot about it. But it's always just so interesting. Again, it's balanced equally between reds and blues and purples. Somebody mentioned purples in the chat. It's very important to note that while we always talk about reds and blues in Braver Angels, probably a third of our members at least consider themselves purple. And so there's definitely a place for you if you kind of reject the whole red-blue divide. We have to do that to get the diversity of thought into the room. But then once you're there, everybody kind of realizes that everybody's pretty much purple. So it's a nice thing. I am at my time, so I'm going to post all those things into the chat, and let me turn it back to Bruce. Thanks so much.